August 1939. While the world held its breath waiting for Hitler to invade Poland, two empires were already locked in a savage, full-scale war that history almost forgot. Over 100,000 soldiers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. A battlefield stretching across the endless steppes of Mongolia. But here's what makes this conflict extraordinary. It was never officially declared. No formal declaration of war. No headlines screaming across American newspapers. Just two superpowers testing each other in what would become one of the most consequential battles you've never heard of. This is the story of Khalkhin Gol, the battle that changed the course of World War II before it even began. The battle that convinced Japan to strike south toward Pearl Harbor instead of north into Siberia. The battle that may have saved the Soviet Union from total destruction. And it all started with a dispute over a river in the middle of nowhere. The powder keg. To understand why two empires went to war over this remote corner of Asia, we need to go back to the 1930s, a decade defined by imperial ambition, territorial expansion, and the growing shadow of inevitable global conflict. By 1939, Imperial Japan had already been on a rampage across Asia for 8 years. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria, transforming it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China, leading to some of the most brutal warfare the world had ever seen. The Japanese military was riding high. Victory after victory had convinced them of their inevitable destiny, to dominate all of Asia under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To them, Japan was not just expanding, it was liberating Asia from Western colonialism and building a new world order. But there was a problem. To the north, another empire had its own plans. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin's iron grip, had been watching Japan's expansion with growing alarm. The two nations shared thousands of miles of border, from Korea in the east, through Manchuria, and all the way to Mongolia in the west. And that border? It was about as clearly defined as a line drawn in sand during a windstorm. Mongolia, officially the Mongolian People's Republic, was a Soviet satellite state. Think of it as the USSR's buffer zone, its first line of defense against Japanese expansion. The Soviets had troops there, advisors, and had essentially turned Mongolia into a proto-Soviet republic. Japan, on the other hand, controlled Manchukuo, which bordered Mongolia along the Khalkhin Gol River. And here's where it gets complicated. Nobody could agree on where exactly the border was. The Japanese claimed the border ran along the Khalkhin Gol River itself. The Soviets insisted it was several miles to the east. Miles of grassland were disputed. And while it might seem absurd to fight over empty steppe, to military strategists, this terrain was everything. Control of this region meant control of potential invasion routes. It meant strategic depth. It meant prestige and momentum in the great game of Asian dominance. For the Japanese Kwantung Army, the elite force stationed in Manchukuo, these border disputes were more than territorial quibbles. They were opportunities to test Soviet resolve, to probe their defenses, to bloody the nose of communism and prove Japanese martial superiority. Between 1932 and 1939, there were literally thousands of border incidents between Japanese and Soviet forces. Most were small, a patrol crossing the line here, a shot fired there, but some escalated into battalion-level engagements with hundreds of casualties. In 1938, two major clashes had already occurred. At Lake Khasan, near the junction of Korea, China, and the USSR, Soviet and Japanese forces fought a vicious 2-week battle involving over 40,000 troops. The Soviets won, but it was costly. The message was clear. These weren't just skirmishes anymore. These were rehearsals for something much bigger. And in May 1939, that something bigger arrived. On May 11, 1939, a unit of Mongolian cavalry crossed the Khalkhin Gol River into what Japan considered Manchukuo territory. The Mongolians insisted they were on their own land. The Japanese weren't interested in arguments. The next day, Japanese cavalry attacked, driving the Mongolians back across the river. Score 1 for Japan. But this wasn't going to end there. Mongolia immediately requested Soviet assistance, and the Soviets, seeing an opportunity to draw a hard line against Japanese expansion, responded with overwhelming force. On May 28th, hundreds of Soviet and Mongolian troops recrossed the river, supported by armored cars and aircraft. The Japanese responded with their own reinforcements. Within days, what had started as a cavalry skirmish had escalated into mechanized warfare involving thousands of soldiers, tanks, and planes. Both sides poured in reinforcements: artillery, tanks, more aircraft. By June, this was no longer a border incident. This was war in everything but name. And sitting in Moscow, watching reports flood in from the Mongolian frontier, Joseph Stalin made a decision that would change everything. He was going to send a message to Tokyo that would echo across the Pacific and ultimately to the shores of Hawaii. But to send that message, he needed the right man. The commanders. Every great battle in history comes down to the men who lead it, and at Khalkhin Gol, two commanders would face each other in what would become a masterclass in military strategy versus military tradition. Meet Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, age 42, a peasant son from a village outside Moscow, a man who had clawed his way up through the Red Army ranks through sheer tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. Zhukov had fought in World War I as a cavalry NCO. He'd survived the brutal Russian Civil War, where he'd proven himself as a cavalry commander. He'd survived Stalin's Great Purge, the nightmare years when the paranoid Soviet dictator had executed or imprisoned over 30,000 Red Army officers, including most of the military's senior leadership. By 1939, the Red Army was in chaos. Experienced commanders were gone, replaced by political commissars and yes-men. Morale was shattered. Military doctrine was in flux. Anyone who showed too much initiative or independent thought risked arrest and execution. But Zhukov was different. He was cautious enough to avoid Stalin's suspicion, but bold enough to innovate. He understood modern mechanized warfare. He'd studied the German military reforms, the tactics of mobile armor and combined arms. And most importantly, he was absolutely fearless when it came to spending lives to achieve victory. Stalin liked that. In June 1939, as the situation at Khalkhin Gol spiraled out of control, Stalin appointed Zhukov to take command. His orders were simple: stop the Japanese, restore Soviet prestige. Show Tokyo that further expansion would be met with steel and blood. Facing Zhukov was the Japanese Kwantung Army, the most prestigious, aggressive, and independent-minded force in the entire Japanese military. These weren't cautious bureaucrats. These were samurai warriors in modern uniforms, men who believed in Bushido, in death before dishonor, in the spiritual superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over material considerations like logistics and firepower. The Japanese military philosophy in 1939 was built on contradictions. On one hand, they had modern equipment, decent tanks, aircraft, artillery. On the other hand, their tactics often seemed lifted straight from the 19th century. They believed that moral superiority and fighting spirit could overcome numerical and material disadvantages. They called it Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, the unbreakable will that made Japanese soldiers superior to all others. The overall Japanese command structure was fragmented. The Kwantung Army operated with near-total independence from Tokyo. Local commanders often made decisions that committed Japan to escalation without approval from the government or even the high command. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The Japanese military culture celebrated aggressive initiative, the bold strike, the fait accompli that forced everyone else to follow. At Khalkhin Gol, this meant Japanese commanders felt emboldened to keep escalating, keep reinforcing, keep attacking, even as the battle grew beyond anyone's original expectations. The contrast between the two military forces couldn't have been starker. The Soviets were bringing in massive amounts of supplies, trucks, fuel, ammunition, food, all transported across thousands of miles of Siberian railroad and Mongolian dirt roads. Zhukov understood that modern war was about logistics as much as tactics. He built up enormous stockpiles, established supply lines, positioned reserves. The Japanese, meanwhile, were operating at the end of incredibly thin supply lines. Their logistics were medieval compared to the Soviets. They relied heavily on horse-drawn carts, on local foraging, on doing more with less. Their philosophy was simple. The will of the warrior overcomes material disadvantages. They'd proven it in Manchuria, in China. Why would Mongolia be different? What they didn't realize was that they were about to face an entirely different kind of enemy. The Chinese armies they'd been fighting were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and divided among warlords. The Red Army, for all its problems, was a modern mechanized force with unlimited resources behind it. And Georgy Zhukov was planning something the Japanese couldn't even imagine. He was going to lure them in, bleed them, and then crush them in a massive encirclement that would make military history. But first, both sides would have to endure a summer of grinding, brutal warfare on the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. The battle explodes. June and July, 1939. While European diplomats scrambled to prevent war over Poland, and while American isolationists insisted the coming conflict was none of their business, two massive armies were already locked in daily combat on the Mongolia-Manchuria border. The battlefield at Khalkhin Gol was like nowhere else on earth. Endless grass steppes, broken by low hills and the winding Khalkhin Gol River. In summer, temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. There was little cover, little shade, and little mercy. By late June, both sides had poured in tens of thousands of troops. The Japanese had approximately 38,000 soldiers, 135 tanks, 225 aircraft, and 400 artillery pieces. The Soviets and Mongolians had about 35,000 troops initially, but Zhukov was bringing in more every day. This was modern mechanized warfare on a scale rarely seen. Tank battles, aerial dogfights involving hundreds of aircraft, artillery barrages that shook the earth for miles. The Soviet tanks, mostly BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks, were technically superior to most Japanese armor, but the Japanese had excellent anti-tank guns and knew how to use terrain to their advantage. In the air, it was a different story. The Soviet Air Force fielded newer aircraft, I-16 fighters, SB-2 bombers. They also had more of them. The Japanese, flying older Ki-27 fighters, found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outgunned. But what the Japanese lacked in equipment, they tried to make up for in aggression. In early July, the Japanese launched a major offensive to drive the Soviets back across the river once and for all. It was classic Japanese tactics, aggressive infantry assaults backed by armor and artillery, relying on fighting spirit and close combat to break Soviet lines. And initially, it worked. Japanese forces smashed into Soviet positions, taking heavy casualties, but gaining ground. For several days, it looked like Japanese valor might actually overcome Soviet material advantage, but Zhukov wasn't panicking. He'd expected this. In fact, he'd planned for it. While the Japanese threw everything they had into the offensive, Zhukov was calmly bringing up reserves, positioning artillery, preparing counterattacks. He let the Japanese exhaust themselves, let them extend their supply lines, let them push deeper into a killing ground. And then he hit them. Soviet artillery opened up in devastating barrages that pulverized Japanese positions. Waves of tanks and infantry followed, supported by constant air attacks. The Japanese, suddenly finding themselves outgunned and surrounded, fought with fanatical courage. They fought to the death in foxholes and trenches. They launched banzai charges against Soviet machine guns. They refused to surrender even when their positions became untenable. By mid-July, the Japanese offensive had been stopped cold. They'd lost thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, and gained nothing. But the Kwantung Army commanders weren't ready to admit defeat. Instead, they demanded more reinforcements, more attacks, more blood. This was the moment when cooler heads should have prevailed, when Tokyo should have stepped in and de-escalated. But the Kwantung Army operated on its own logic, and that logic said, never retreat, never surrender, attack until victory. So they prepared for another offensive, even bigger than the first. Zhukov, meanwhile, was planning something entirely different. He wasn't interested in just winning another round of attacks and counterattacks. He wanted total victory. He wanted to destroy the Japanese forces so completely that Tokyo would never dare challenge the Soviet Union again. He was planning a double envelopment, a massive pincer movement that would encircle and annihilate the entire Japanese force. It would require perfect coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. It would require attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. It would require secrecy, speed, and overwhelming force. In other words, it would require everything the Japanese assumed the Soviets were incapable of, and in August, Zhukov would prove them catastrophically wrong. Operation Annihilation, August 20th, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Khalkhin Gol River. For weeks there had been a strange lull in the fighting. Japanese scouts reported that Soviet forces seemed to be digging in, reinforcing defensive positions. The Japanese commanders were pleased. Clearly, the Soviets had lost their appetite for offensive action. One more push, they thought, and the Reds would break. They had no idea what was coming. Georgy Zhukov had spent the previous 3 weeks preparing the largest military operation the Soviet Union had conducted since the Russian Civil War. He'd assembled an overwhelming force, 58,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops, 498 tanks, 385 armored cars, 542 artillery pieces, and 515 aircraft. Every unit had been carefully positioned. Every artillery battery had pre-plotted targets. Every tank formation knew exactly where to advance. Zhukov had even brought in bombers to simulate the sound of artillery during the buildup, masking the noise of tanks being moved into position. The Japanese suspected nothing. August 20th, 5:45 a.m., 300 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The earth erupted, the sky turned black with smoke and explosions. For 2.5 hours, shells rained down on Japanese positions in a non-stop bombardment that obliterated foxholes, destroyed equipment, and shattered morale. Japanese soldiers huddled in their trenches could do nothing but endure. Communications were cut. Command posts were destroyed. The artillery barrage was so intense that it created a fog of war more impenetrable than any smokescreen. And then the tanks came. At 8:45 a.m., the artillery lifted, and 498 Soviet tanks rolled forward from the north and south simultaneously. 2 massive armored wings designed to punch through Japanese flanks and meet behind them, trapping the entire force in a giant pocket. This was combined arms warfare at its most devastating. Tanks supported by infantry supported by artillery directed by aircraft protecting everything from above. The Soviet Air Force, with total air superiority, bombed and strafed Japanese positions with impunity. Japanese fighters that rose to challenge them were quickly shot down or driven off. The Japanese fought with their characteristic fanaticism. Units that were surrounded refused to surrender, fighting to the death even when their situation was hopeless. But bravery couldn't stop tanks. Courage couldn't intercept bombs. Fighting spirit didn't deflect artillery shells. By August 23rd, Zhukov's pincers had closed. The Japanese Sixth Army was completely surrounded. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped in a pocket with dwindling supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope of escape. For the next week, the Soviets methodically crushed the pocket. Artillery pounded Japanese positions day and night. Tanks and infantry attacked from all sides. Aircraft bombed anything that moved. The Japanese refused to surrender en masse. Individual units fought to annihilation. Officers committed suicide rather than face capture. Soldiers launched final banzai charges that accomplished nothing except adding to the death toll. By August 31st, it was over. The Japanese Sixth Army had been destroyed. Out of approximately 38,000 Japanese soldiers engaged in the battle, over 18,000 were dead or missing. Thousands more were wounded. Nearly all their tanks, artillery, and vehicles were destroyed or captured. Soviet and Mongolian losses were also severe, approximately 9,000 dead and 16,000 wounded, but they had won a complete and total victory. Georgy Zhukov had pulled off one of the most successful encirclement battles in military history. He'd used tactics that would later become his trademark: massed armor, overwhelming firepower, deep encirclement, and the willingness to accept casualties to achieve decisive victory. Stalin was impressed, very impressed. Remember this name, Zhukov. In 2 years, this same man would save Moscow from the Germans. In 1945, he'd capture Berlin. But that was the future. In August 1939, the question was, what would Japan do next? Would they escalate, launch a full-scale war, attack the Soviet Union with their entire army? Or would they learn the lesson Zhukov had just taught them? The consequences. September 1st, 1939. While Japanese commanders were still reeling from their catastrophic defeat at Khalkhin Gol, Adolf Hitler's army smashed into Poland. World War II had officially begun. Suddenly, what had been the world's biggest active conflict was overshadowed by events in Europe. The secret war in Mongolia was about to become very secret indeed, because nobody in the West was paying attention anymore. On September 15, 1939, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a ceasefire agreement. The border would be fixed at the line the Soviets claimed Japan would withdraw. The fighting was over. But the consequences? Those were just beginning. Inside the Japanese government and military, a fierce debate erupted. It was a debate that would determine the course of the Pacific War and ultimately bring America into World War II. The debate was simple. Which way should Japan expand? There were two options, north or south. The Northern Expansion faction argued that Japan should attack the Soviet Union, conquer Siberia, and seize its vast resources of oil, timber, and minerals. These were the traditionalists, the officers who saw communism as Japan's natural enemy and the Soviet Union as weak and ripe for conquest. Before Khalkhin Gol, this faction had been dominant. They'd looked at Stalin's purges, the Red Army's poor performance in other conflicts, and assumed Soviet weakness. But Khalkhin Gol changed everything. The Soviets hadn't been weak. They'd been overwhelmingly powerful. They had better equipment, better logistics, better tactics, and better commanders. Fighting the USSR would mean fighting a modern, mechanized army with industrial resources Japan couldn't match. The Northern Expansion faction lost the argument. The Southern Expansion faction won. Their argument was compelling. Southeast Asia was rich in resources Japan desperately needed: oil, rubber, tin, rice. It was defended by colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, who were already fighting Hitler in Europe and couldn't defend their Asian colonies adequately. Attacking south meant attacking weak enemies instead of strong ones. It meant resources instead of frozen tundra. It meant quick victories instead of grinding stalemate. There was just one problem: the United States. America had colonies and bases across the Pacific: the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and most importantly, the Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. If Japan moved south, it would inevitably bring them into conflict with the United States. The Southern expansion faction knew this, but after Khalkhin Gol, they believed they had no choice. Better to attack the Americans, wealthy but soft, unprepared for war, than attack the Soviets, who had just proven they could destroy Japanese armies. So on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The Pacific became a battlefield, and all of it traced back to a summer day in 1939 on the banks of a river in Mongolia that most Americans had never heard of. But there was another consequence, perhaps even more important. June 22, 1941. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. 4 million German and Axis soldiers smashed into the Soviet Union along a 2,000-mile front. Within months, the Germans had conquered vast territories, captured millions of Soviet soldiers, and were racing toward Moscow. The Soviet Union was on the brink of total collapse. Stalin desperately needed troops to defend Moscow, but he had a problem. He had to keep large forces in the Far East to guard against potential Japanese attack. If Japan invaded Siberia while the Germans were attacking from the west, the Soviet Union would be finished. Enter Richard Sorge, a Soviet master spy embedded in Tokyo. In October 1941, Sorge sent a message that changed history. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. They were committed to the southern expansion. The Soviets' rear was secure. Stalin immediately ordered the transfer of battle-hardened Siberian divisions from the Far East to Moscow. Fresh troops, equipped for winter warfare, who hadn't been ground down by months of desperate fighting. These divisions arrived just in time to spearhead the Soviet counteroffensive that stopped the Germans at the gates of Moscow in December 1941. It was the first major German defeat of the war. Without those Siberian divisions, Moscow might have fallen. The Soviet Union might have collapsed. The entire course of World War II might have been different. And the reason Stalin could safely move those troops? Because in August 1939, Georgy Zhukov had convinced Japan that attacking north was suicide. One battle, one decision, ripple effects that changed the world. The forgotten triumph. Today, if you travel to eastern Mongolia, you can visit the battlefield at Khalkhin Gol. There are monuments there, Soviet tanks preserved as memorials, obelisks marking mass graves, museums displaying artifacts from the battle. Russian tourists come to honor the Red Army's victory. Japanese tourists come to remember their countrymen who died in a war their nation never officially declared. But in the West? Almost nobody has heard of this battle. Western histories of World War II typically begin with Poland in 1939 or Pearl Harbor in 1941. Khalkhin Gol, if it's mentioned at all, gets a footnote, a curiosity, a weird fact to share at parties. But that's a profound misunderstanding of history. Khalkhin Gol was the battle that set the Pacific War in motion. It was the battle that convinced Japan to attack Pearl Harbor instead of invading Siberia. It was the battle that allowed the Soviet Union to survive the German invasion. It was the battle where one of history's greatest generals, Georgy Zhukov, first demonstrated the tactics he'd use to eventually capture Berlin. Zhukov himself later said that the experience at Khalkhin Gol taught him everything he needed to know about modern warfare: the importance of logistics, the power of combined arms, the necessity of overwhelming force, the value of surprise and deception. All lessons he'd apply again and again in the battles that would save the Soviet Union and defeat Nazi Germany. In terms of scale, Khalkhin Gol was massive. Over 100,000 troops engaged, nearly 50,000 casualties. Losses comparable to many battles that are household names, but because it was never officially declared as a war, because it happened in a remote corner of Asia, because it was overshadowed by the European war that started weeks later, it vanished from popular memory. For decades, both sides kept details classified. The Soviets didn't want to reveal their tactics. The Japanese didn't want to acknowledge the defeat. It wasn't until the Cold War ended that historians could piece together the full story. Modern military historians now recognize Khalkhin Gol as one of the most important battles of the 20th century. It was the first large-scale demonstration of deep battle doctrine, the Soviet military theory emphasizing mobile warfare, combined arms, and operational depth. It was also a preview of World War II itself, the tanks, the aircraft, the massive encirclements, the total war between industrial powers. Everything that would define the next 6 years of global conflict was on display in miniature in Mongolia in 1939. The double envelopment Zhukov executed at Khalkhin Gol? He'd used the same tactic at Stalingrad in 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army. The coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power? That became standard Soviet doctrine throughout the war. The emphasis on material superiority and logistics over fighting spirit? That's how the Allies won World War II. The Japanese, meanwhile, learned the wrong lessons. Instead of recognizing that their military doctrine was fundamentally flawed, that banzai charges and fighting spirit couldn't overcome industrial firepower, they doubled down. They took the same tactics that failed at Khalkhin Gol and used them throughout the Pacific War. The result? Catastrophic defeats, suicidal defense, and ultimately the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese military never adapted to modern warfare until it was too late, which brings us to the fascinating what-if questions that historians love to debate. What if Japan had won at Khalkhin Gol? What if they'd convinced themselves the Soviets were weak and vulnerable? Would they have attacked north in 1941 instead of south? Would there have been no Pearl Harbor? Would America have stayed out of the war? And if Japan had attacked Siberia in June 1941, coordinating with the German invasion, could the Soviet Union have survived? Fighting a two-front war against both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, with no Siberian divisions to save Moscow? It's entirely possible that a Japanese victory at Khalkhin Gol could have led to the complete destruction of the Soviet Union, a Nazi-dominated Europe, a Japanese-dominated Asia, a world so fundamentally different from ours that we can barely imagine it. Instead, because Zhukov defeated the Japanese decisively, completely, and brutally, Japan chose a different path. A path that led to Pearl Harbor, to America's entry into the war, and, ultimately, to Allied victory. For the Soviet soldiers and Mongolian troops who fought at Khalkhin Gol, their sacrifice wasn't forgotten in their own countries. Soviet veterans received medals, and honors Mongolia built museums and monuments. The battle became a cornerstone of Soviet military history and pride. For the Japanese soldiers, it was more complicated. Many died in a war their government never officially acknowledged. Many survivors returned home to a nation that wanted to forget the defeat. Official Japanese military histories downplayed the battle for decades. But in recent years, there's been a growing recognition in Japan of what happened at Khalkhin Gol and why it mattered. Japanese historians have written detailed accounts, survivors published memoirs. Descendants visit the battlefield to honor their ancestors. The truth is finally coming out, and the truth is this: Khalkhin Gol was not a border skirmish. It was not a minor incident. It was a full-scale war between two superpowers that determined the course of World War II before the official war even began. It was the secret war that wasn't really secret, just ignored. The steppes of Mongolia are peaceful now. The grasslands that once echoed with artillery fire and tank engines are silent except for the wind. The only residents are nomadic herders and their livestock, living the same way their ancestors lived for thousands of years. But beneath that grass lie the remains of tanks, artillery shells, and the bones of soldiers who died in a war history forgot. Their sacrifice mattered. It mattered more than almost anyone realizes. Without Khalkhin Gol, there might have been no Pearl Harbor. Without Khalkhin Gol, the Soviet Union might have fallen in 1941. Without Khalkhin Gol, the world we live in today might look completely different. This was the battle that changed everything while changing nothing, because the borders stayed where they were, and most of the world never noticed it happened. But the soldiers who fought there knew. The generals who learned from it knew. The historians who study it know. Khalkhin Gol was the secret war Japan lost before Pearl Harbor, and losing it may have been the most consequential defeat in modern military history. Because sometimes the battles that shape history aren't the ones with the biggest monuments or the most famous names. Sometimes they're the ones fought in the middle of nowhere, witnessed by almost no one, remembered by even fewer. But they matter all the same.